Hello, this is Lorraine Maclauchlan, the forest entomologist for the Thompson-Okanagan region. My talk is titled A Retrospective Look at Pests in Young Stands, the 1990s versus 2020, Changes and Implications. The forest landscape in BC has undergone many landscape level disturbances, which have shaped the forests of our generation. However, over the past 50 or more years, BC has experienced larger, more frequent, and often unprecedented landscape-level disturbances, such as the mountain pine beetle outbreak and more recently, major wildfire events. There has been many mountain pine beetle outbreaks in our interior pine forests, but the last two major outbreaks, occurring in the 1970s to 1980s, and more recently in the 1990s through 2000s, were the main impetus for accelerated harvesting and reforestation efforts within the interior of BC. Following the 1980s outbreak, there was an increased awareness and focus put on our young stands, and many asked the question, what pests are affecting these young stands? Also, there was quite a push for stand tending and improvements to be done in these stands, such as spacing and pruning. The 2000s mountain pine beetle outbreak was a stark example of climate change effects on an insect and its host. Trees were more vulnerable. Climate was more favorable for insect development and dispersal. As a result, both mature stands and young stands were affected and were fair game for the beetle during this outbreak. Other landscape disturbances have also left their mark on our forests, such as the severe drought and fires of 2017 and 2018. These cumulative disturbances on the land base have dramatically accelerated harvesting and reforestation efforts, resulting in a vast landscape of young forests, many composed of pure lodgepole pine or mixtures of lodgepole pine and other species. So how has climate affected the pests in young stands? There are numerous ways to evaluate the health of young stands and their performance and development over time. Some of these include the incidence of pests at distinct points in time, the impact of pests over the development of stands over time following individual pests, pest abundance and complexity in the past, meaning 20 years ago, compared to what we see in present-day stands. There are many questions that need addressing in regard to pests, their impact and occurrence, especially in the light of our changing climate and forest structure. Not all pests are created equal or cause lasting damage, but some pests can significantly affect growth, form, and survival. That is what I will try to unravel in this talk. This presentation highlights some key findings from 3 different projects. This slide shows the continuum of the last 2 mountain pine beetle outbreaks. You can see the mature pine killed by the 2000s outbreak. You can see the young stands that were regenerated as a result of harvesting after the 1970s outbreak. And you can also see recent harvesting, which represents the young stands that we are now seeing in 2020. What's also graphically evident is that young stands were attacked and killed by the mountain pine beetle in this last outbreak, a direct result of climate change. Then and now. As our climate changes, so could the suite of pests and damaging agents that affect our young stands. The impact of insects, disease, and other damaging agents may be different under these new climatic and stand conditions. Back in the late 1990s to 2000s, I conducted over 186 surveys in young stands to determine the incidence of pests within these stands. 4 biogeoclimatic zones were looked at. Fast forward to 2019 and 2020. I thought, what are the pests in the stands that are now currently 15 to 20 years old? So I conducted 130 stand surveys in the same biogeoclimatic zones and compared density, pest complexity, and impact in these young stands. I will highlight some of the key points from this study. I'll start by comparing the average density of lodgepole pine across all biogeoclimatic zones in the late 90s surveys compared to the surveys done in the last 2 years. The good news is that on average, density in young stands now is higher than in stands of comparative age 20 years ago. However, 30 to over 40% of stems currently are what we'd call ingress, or unlikely to become crop trees. 81% crop and 68% ingress are affected by one or more damaging agents. Next, I looked at the average number of pests per stand. In the 1998 surveys, I found just under 5 different pest organisms per stand. In the 2020 surveys, I found on average 7 different types of pests per stand. Then I looked at the percent lodgepole pine affected by pests then and now. Across all 4 ecosystems, I saw a higher percent of pine affected by one or more damaging agents in 2020 than in 1998 surveys, sometimes double that observed 20 years ago. Digging deeper into the specific pests that were being recorded in these 2 time periods, this graph shows the percent of stands affected by a selection of pests. There were other damaging agents recorded, but typically at lower or very site-specific levels. Many of the more common and typically damaging pests were found in more stands in 2020 than recorded in 1998. A few things to bring to your attention, though, are the more cyclical agents, some of the animals or foliar diseases such as Lophodomella. If a foliar disease was not in outbreak mode, often detection was quite difficult. Whereas some of the stem rust and terminal weevils, drought, and suppression or competition were notably affecting more stands in the 2019-2020 surveys than they were 20 years ago. The lower slide now looks at the average percent of trees affected by these pests. There was little difference among many of the pests. However, what jumps out in this slide is western gall rust, terminal weevil, drought, and competition. Western gall rust was more than double what it was back in the late 1990s, and terminal weevil, drought, and competition also increased significantly. These 3 graphs show the percent stems affected by western gall rust, lodgepole pine terminal weevil, and drought. Of note is that there are more stems affected in the 2020 surveys than the 1998 surveys across all 4 ecosystems. Of particular note is in the ESSF, when more trees are affected in 2020 with western gall rust, and significantly more stems are affected by lodgepole pine terminal weevil. This insect is most likely responding to longer and more favorable summer conditions where it can complete its development and successfully attack more trees. Drought is also much more predominant in the 2020 surveys. Stands are being affected by damaging agents at a higher rate now than 20 years ago. However, not all pests impact tree form, growth, or survival. Changing climate is affecting trees, pests, and pest impact on trees. Commander blister rust and stalactiform blister rust, shown on this slide, didn't really show distinct trends across the ecosystems. However, again, in the ESSF, we saw dramatically more stems being affected in this ecosystem. So again, this might reflect conditions more favorable for infection now than what we saw 20 years ago. I also want to draw your attention to pests on other tree species. Spruce was often a secondary species in the stands we surveyed, and Coulee spruce gall adelgid was present across all biogeoclimatic zones, affecting up to 93% of spruce. But this insect really causes no impact. However, we also saw spruce weevil affecting over 25% of the spruce in stands across all biogeoclimatic zones, And as we know, spruce weevil causes severe stem defects and suppression. So this could be a major implication for our future mixed stands. Also very obvious in our surveys was the amount of drought and its effect on both pine and other species. As we know, drought affects all species. Drought mortality was very high, but particularly in the montane spruce stands. But we had significant mortality also in the ICH and IDF. Drought kills trees outright, but it also increases the susceptibility to insects and other pathogens that are present in the stands. Of other note was what we call suppression or competition. In many stands, we saw a lot of ingress or competition, particularly in the montane spruce, and these trees may never reach what we call crop tree status. We had a major drought event in 2017, but also back in 1998, we had what then we thought was a major drought event. So this coincides nicely with when the two large surveys of young stands were conducted. So we would expect to see the effects of droughts in both of the surveys that we conducted. The 1998 and 2017 events were both severe, but at very different scales, with 10,000 hectares of mortality being recorded in 1998 and over 100,000 hectares of mortality recorded as a result of the 2017 drought event, and this is in the Thompson-Okanagan region. Symptoms were widespread and most noticeable in young lodgepole pine stands 50 years of age or younger. What I want to bring your attention to is not only can drought kill trees outright, but also it causes stress on those trees. The drought may not directly kill the trees, but then secondary insects can come in, colonize these trees, and then kill them. In the next few slides, I highlight the results from 17 long-term installations located throughout the Thompson-Okanagan region. This slide lists the more predominant pests found within these plots. Lodgepole pine terminal weevil and western gall rust were present in all plots, with the weevil affecting on average 32% of the pine and gall rust affecting on average 18% of the pine. Commander blister rust was present in almost 60% of the plots, affecting on average 12% of the pine. Atripellis was found in 43% of the plots, affecting 11% of the trees on average. Squirrel feeding, which can cause quite severe damage, was found in just under 30% of the plots, affecting on average 16% of the trees. Stalactiform blister rust was not found in as many plots, but in the plots where it was present, it affected on average 5% of the trees. I've averaged the data from all of these plots to look at how many pests affect each individual tree. And it's quite noticeable that in the MS, there are typically more pests per tree than we see in the other ecosystems, with the ESSF, the bar in yellow, showing the fewest multiple pest occurrences per tree. In the montane spruce, there is almost 10% of stems having more than 4 pests per tree. What is the ultimate objective that we want from our young stands? Does tree form matter? Not all pests kill trees, some just affect the form of the trees. The lodgepole pine terminal weevil is one of these pests. What's seen here is a current attack from lodgepole pine terminal weevil, and it's unsure how the tree will respond to this attack, but over time the tree will either outgrow the attack or will see some kind of major stem defect as pictured in this slide. In these long-term installations, I followed every weevil attack on each tree over time. Right after attack, there was a wide spectrum of defects following attack. I categorized these into a crease, crook, fork, or stag hat. However, over time, you could see differentiation in how the tree responded to these attacks. About 400 stems per hectare resulted in a crease from a weevil attack, which means there was little or no impact to the form of the tree. Very few attacks resulted in a multiple top or a staghead, seen by the red line. However, crooks and forks were very dominant. About 200 stems per hectare of trees attacked by the weevil resulted in a crook or a fork. I then combined these categories into either a minor defect, shown in black, or a major defect, shown in red. And what you'll see here is about 50% of attacks by the weevil will result in a major stem defect to the tree. I want to clarify the concept of tree form. At the final assessment, I put each tree into one of three form types: good, moderate, or poor. This assessment was done based on the presence of major stem defects, branchiness, or a broken top. As seen in this slide, trees were more likely to have good form if they had fewer pests per tree. The percent of pine with good form dramatically decreased the more pests were found on an individual tree. Conversely, the likelihood of a tree exhibiting poor form increased dramatically as it had 1, 2, or more than 3 pests per tree. I wanted to look at commander rust in young pine stands. This graph is taken from one plot located in the IDF DM, and it shows how Commandra affected trees in this stand from 1995 up to 2014. In 1995, there was no mortality due to Commandra, but we had just over 100 branch infections and just under 200 stem infections. Fast forward to 2014, and we saw that over 550 stems per hectare were killed by Commandra. We still had about 100 stem infections, yet very few branch infections. So it's clear that if you have Commandra in a stand, it can severely affect the ultimate number of live trees or crop trees that you'll have come harvest. Shown on the left is a weevil, Pisodi swartzii, that affects stems affected by Commandra blister rust, which you may say, well, this doesn't matter because Commandra will kill the trees anyway. But what I want to emphasize is this insect hones in on very stressed trees. So think about drought stress or trees affected by other, perhaps not mortality-causing pests. If this insect is attracted to these trees, it too could kill the trees. In summary, the incidence of pests and their impact is changing with our changing climatic conditions. Incidence surveys are valuable for identifying patterns over a landscape and a point in time. Incidence surveys provide valuable information as to where more intense monitoring is needed. Also critical are long-term installations. These long-term installations provide impact data for individual pests over the life of a tree and a stand. These installations are required to make accurate forest yield projections for midterm and long-term timber supply modeling. In summary, young stands have more species mixes and higher stems per hectare. However, more stands are being impacted by damaging agents now than they were 20 years ago. The information I gave you from long-term installations show the progression of pest damage and impact over time, and underscores the need that we need to clearly identify the desired goals for these stands. We can assume that pests and climate damage will increase in the next few decades, so we must learn from these various studies and design our future forest with a clear goal in mind and aim for greater resilience. I'd like to acknowledge all the help I had on these projects and the funding from the land-based investment funds and the Forest Sciences Ecosystem Health and Disturbance Portfolio. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I hope you enjoyed all the other presentations in the Health of Young Stands forum. Finally, just a few take-home points for you to consider.